One believes the past can be buried, that the silence of the years will cover it, convincing us that even the deepest wounds have healed over. But what I didn't know was that some lies don't decay beneath the earth. They merely wait. And that day, when the phone rang, it was the ghost of a past I had thought dead for 20 years, calling to drag back into the light the accusations that had once inflicted the greatest pain of my life.
Together with my husband, Richard, we had built a kind of life people envied, admired as the most hardworking and respected couple in our small English town. With the little business we had started from nothing, I had a blind faith that every dream we built for the future was shared, and every foundation we relied on was unshakable. Never once did I imagine that this faith would one day become the walls of my own prison. I never realized how the vibrant, loving man I had married had, over time, given way to a stranger, a man full of secrets, short-tempered, and trapped in a despair I could never quite understand. I excused his unease as nothing more than the heavy stress placed upon his shoulders by our growing business. Not for a moment did I suspect the poisonous betrayal that had already begun to take root just beneath the surface. And then came that cursed day when my husband, too afraid to face his own failures, chose the coward's way. To shield himself from the financial ruin he had created, he wrote a vile tale in which I was cast as the villain, spreading unspeakable lies and accusations about me. When he slammed the door behind him, he didn't just walk away, he took my honor and my future with him. In the days that followed, I was forced to watch the seeds of his lies flourish in the fertile soil of small-town gossip. The very community that had once admired me transformed into a merciless jury, condemning me without question. It wasn't only my marriage that collapsed, but my reputation, my entire world, brought crashing down in a brutal public execution of character. Carrying the heavy, invisible cloak of shame my husband had cast upon my shoulders, I drifted through the endless years that followed, years in which the woman once respected and full of life became little more than a ghost haunting her own town. To survive, I took whatever odd jobs I could find for a few pounds, enduring a life of back-breaking, lonely labor that seemed to stretch on without end. Through the slow passage of countless solitary days and nights, I learned to find peace not in the company of those who had judged me, but in the silent companionship of books and in the simple, honest loyalty of a stray cat that cared nothing for the poisonous gossip of the past. Within the four walls of a modest flat, I built a smaller, humbler world that was at least my own. Perhaps it was in the 10th year of this exile that I came to a shattering realization. Richard had succeeded in stealing my reputation, my work, even my youth. But there was one thing he could never take from me, the resilient core of my own soul. In that moment of clarity, I abandoned the futile hope of an apology that would never come and began the true journey of healing from within. After 20 years of patient and quiet rebuilding, I had at last achieved a life of dignity and solitude, one hard-won by my own willpower. The ghosts of the past had faded into nothing more than faint, powerless whispers, and for the first time, I was at peace. But in the stillness of that carefully constructed sanctuary, the sudden shrill voice of the telephone shattered me like a stone hurled against stained glass. In a single instant, it tore apart the fragile piece I had woven over 2 decades, resurrecting the monster I had tried half a lifetime to bury in the deepest earth. During those few eternal seconds of the phone's ringing, a terrible battle raged within me. On one side, the instinct to let it fall silent and protect the fragile piece I had so carefully built. On the other, the sudden and violent awakening of the long-dormant warrior within me, demanding at last to confront the ghost that had haunted me for 20 years. Yet instead of the voice I half expected, that of my former husband, Richard, I was met with the thin, trembling tone of a complete stranger. Far from easing my doubts, her voice knotted a cold weight of dread deep in my stomach. In that instant, I knew instinctively that nothing good could come from a telephone call that shattered 2 decades of silence. When she introduced herself as Richard's second wife, it felt as if the very foundation of the story I had lived for 20 years, the story of a cruel man who abandoned me under a cloud of false accusations, had been violently rewritten. A new chapter had been added, one I had never even imagined existed, a chapter that poured the poison of infidelity into an already festering wound of betrayal. And then came the final world-shaking blow, to learn that the man who had destroyed my life and then vanished without a trace was now dying, and in his last moments had the audacity to summon me to his side. In the silence of my kitchen, clutching the cold plastic receiver that had become a conduit, binding me to a past I had never truly understood, and to a future I had no idea how to face, I found myself utterly frozen.
The silence that followed that phone call weighed on me far more heavily than the 20 years of silence that had come before it. My mind reeled, struggling to process the double shock, the revelation of a secret marriage and the summons to the deathbed of the man whose lies had once entombed me alive. As the scattered fragments of my past violently rearranged themselves into this dreadful new picture, I felt my initial shock harden into a cold, illuminating anger. I realized then that the mountain of slander he had heaped upon me all those years ago was not the desperate panic of a broken man, but a carefully calculated strategy, a way to destroy my credibility, so that no one would question his quiet disappearance into the new life he had already built. With that poisonous knowledge burning inside me, I made the painful decision to break my long silence and share it with the only witness to my years of suffering, my daughter. I knew that dragging her father's ghost back into the light would inevitably tear open old wounds for her as well. Yet I could no longer bear the weight of this monstrous truth alone. And in the moment when I looked into her protective, loving eyes and heard her offer me the same permission for peace I had already, in my heart, given myself, something colder and more resolute took shape within me. It was not born of reconciliation, nor of sudden mercy. It was the fierce need to stand tall one last time before the architect of my ruin, to force him to meet the gaze of the woman he had failed to destroy.
Leaving behind the quiet refuge I had spent 20 years building, this journey felt far less like a simple drive and far more like a descent into the very heart of the past I had spent half my life trying to escape. With every mile left behind, another fragile layer of hard-won peace was stripped away, exposing the tender scars still hidden beneath. The monotonous hum of the car became the soundtrack to a parade of painful memories playing in my mind. Yet what returned to me were not the beautiful days my husband's lies had long since twisted beyond recognition, but the sharp, wounding words of his slander and the cold, indifferent look in his eyes on the day he walked away. Each memory did not soften my heart, but hardened my resolve for the final confrontation awaiting me. Arriving not at a grand manner that might have justified, in some twisted way, the magnitude of his betrayal, but at a weary, anonymous flat in a crowded city street, I felt the bitter irony of it all. I finally understood how the glorious new life for which he had sacrificed my honor and our shared past had shrunk into something so small, so pitifully meaningless. And in that last moment of resolve, when I gently refused my daughter's loving offer of protection, I knew with absolute clarity that the closing act of this long war would not be fought with armies. It would be settled in the presence of only the two who had been there at the beginning: the man who wrote the lie and the woman who had survived it.
In that quiet limbo where past and present collided in the heavy silence of the corridor, I finally came face to face with a woman who had been, knowingly or not, the other half of my husband's great deception. And in her weary eyes, I did not see a triumphant rival, but simply another victim of the lifelong selfishness that had defined him. The man who had lived in my memory as a towering, monstrous giant for 20 years now lay reduced to a frail, skeletal figure, gasping for breath in a rented hospital bed. The dull shock of that sight extinguished in an instant the burning anger I had so carefully kept alive, leaving only a cold, hollow pity for the ruin he had become. Standing at his side, listening to the pitiful, half-formed excuses spilling from his lips, I understood with liberating clarity that I had not come here to hear his justifications, nor to grant him the selfish comfort of a deathbed pardon. His reasons and his regrets no longer carried the slightest weight in the life I had built without him. And in that silent moment of ultimate confrontation, I discovered my victory did not lie in shouting accusations or demanding apologies. It lay in the undeniable strength of my presence, the living proof of his failure to destroy me. Turning away without another word, I was not fleeing the past, but closing the door on a finished chapter and stepping into the clear, untainted air of my own future.
As I closed the car door, the feeling was as if I had shut the cover on the longest and most painful book of my life. And in that silent moment, when my daughter, without a single word, understood from my calm composure that the war was over, that her mother had returned from the battlefield, not broken, but victorious. It was worth more than any triumphant speech ever could have been. Our journey home no longer felt like an advance into hostile territory, but its exact opposite, a retreat from conquered ground, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of a man and the smoldering ruins of a life built on lies. When my daughter's gentle question finally pierced the heavy silence, I was forced to confront the vast, hollow space inside me, the place that anger and the pursuit of justice had occupied for so long. I realized I did not yet have a name for what I was feeling. It was an entirely new state of being, born after decades of living inside a storm. And as I spoke aloud the simple truth of that moment, I tasted the strange contradiction of falling into emptiness with a loss of the purpose that had carried me forward for weeks, and at the same time being lifted by the release from the crushing weight of the injustice that had defined my life for so many years. That this lightness was nothing less than the fragile first taste of the freedom I had just reclaimed for myself.
In that simple pause on my own doorstep, I understood its deeper meaning. For 20 years, this threshold had been a barrier behind which I hid from a world that had wronged me. But that night, stepping across it no longer felt like entering as a refugee. It felt like crossing into a new existence as the rightful, liberated queen of my own life. Re-entering my small, quiet sanctuary carried the surreal sense that even the very air inside the flat had been cleansed of the stubborn residue of grief. Every familiar object seemed to shine with a new light, and I felt the space transform from a shelter that merely kept out pain into a true home filled with a promise of peace and a future. When my daughter asked her simple question about the future, words that once would have seemed meaningless to a life dictated entirely by the rigid routine of survival, its weight and wonder struck me. Before me now stretched an uncharted map brimming with endless, dizzying, and slightly frightening possibilities. Possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. And at the end of that long, transformative day, I realized the truth of my victory. It did not require me to rush to fill the new emptiness inside me with grand plans or dramatic change. Instead, it offered me a rare and precious gift, the stillness of simply existing without the need to fight, to justify, or to endure. For the first time, I could simply breathe in the clear air of a life that was, at last, entirely my own.
In the first few days of my newfound freedom, each quiet morning and each peaceful afternoon flowed by with a beautiful, almost dreamlike simplicity, soothing the old wounds of my soul like a gentle balm. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the world, with all its chaos, had finally agreed to leave me in the peace I had so long deserved. So when the phone rang again, no longer holding the power to shatter my world, but reduced to an ordinary interruption, I knew, as I took the receiver from my daughter, that I was not the frightened woman of a week before. I was a calm, steady observer, ready to receive the inevitable closing note of a story already finished. Hearing the news of his death brought me neither grief nor satisfaction, only a strange, hollow stillness, a quiet finality that settled within me. yet with it came a heavier burden, carried in the question asked by his second wife. That the man who had violently exiled himself from my life now dared, even in death, to lay at my door the responsibility for his final resting place. My refusal, given with the clarity and strength I had gained, was not an act of spite, but an act of truth, by insisting that his body be buried within the life he had chosen. I was not only protecting the fragile peace I had fought so hard to win, but performing one last essential act of housekeeping. I was making certain that the final chapter of his story would not be written as a false footnote to mine, but placed where it rightfully belonged, in the book he had chosen for himself.
I began to sense a subtle yet undeniable shift in the social air of the town. The harsh, judging stares I had been forced to endure for 20 years were slowly giving way to hesitant, questioning looks. And in that change, I could feel the seeds of a new narrative beginning to sprout in the barren soil where I had long been condemned. I witnessed a surreal moment when an old friend, whose silence had been one of the sharpest stones in the wall of my loneliness, approached me with eyes full of shame. She admitted that the truth, after its strange and winding journey, had finally found its way home. The same gossip that had once carried the lies which destroyed my reputation was now carrying the truth with equal eagerness. Hearing that long-delayed apology, arriving not in the years when I was broken and in need of an ally, but only now, when their approval meant nothing to me, left me with a hollow, unsatisfying feeling. I understood that forgiveness was no longer a burden I had to carry. My peace no longer depended on their confessions, for I had already built it upon their absence. As I closed my door on the town's belated gestures of reconciliation, I reached a final understanding about reputation and society. Though truth had at last cleared my name in the eyes of the world, the only judgment that had ever truly mattered was the one I had already rendered in the quiet solitude of my own heart. The verdict of innocence, resilience, and survival, long before the whispers had turned in my favor.
On that strange pilgrimage to the skeletal remains of our old business, a place I had avoided for 20 years, as if it were a graveyard, I discovered something unexpected. Standing before its ruins no longer filled me with the ghosts of past failures. Instead, from the ashes rose a bold and surprising spark of a new beginning. The moment I told my daughter of my plan to revive the place that had once symbolized my greatest humiliation in the eyes of the town, I knew I was making a defiant choice. It would not merely erase the ugly memories bound to those walls, but actively rewrite them into a story of renewal and hope, with every sweep of the broom feeling like the clearing away of an old lie, and every flower planted like an act of faith in the future. I found the act of reclaiming that space deeply healing. Around me stood not the shifting sands of gossip, but a small, devoted circle built upon the solid ground of shared work and mutual respect. And as I reached a final understanding of what it truly means to rebuild a life, I realized that freedom does not lie in the quiet solitude of my flat, but in stepping boldly back into the world. It lies in using the very stones once thrown at me to build a new garden, not only for myself, but as a sanctuary for anyone still searching for a place
not with speeches or celebrations, but with the hesitant, respectful steps of the very townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid me, the quiet and unassuming opening day of my little sanctuary felt like a silent treaty signed between my past and my present. Their presence in my new garden was a wordless act of peace. I realized that the deep and unexpected joy I felt did not come from their apologies or their praise, but from the simple human bonds of teaching someone a new skill or listening to the story of an old friend. In place of the reputation my husband had tried to destroy, I had built something far more authentic and resilient, founded not on wealth or success, but on quiet strength and the desire to cultivate beauty in broken places. In one humble moment, when a stranger, a young woman, approached me not as an object of pity or scandal, but as a torchbearer of survival, I understood that the deeper purpose of my suffering was perhaps never simply to endure it. It was to transform it into a quiet well of empathy from which others lost in their own dark forests might draw a small measure of strength. After years of feeling like an outcast, I realized I had finally found my true place, not by forcing my way back into the social circles that once rejected me, but by building a small new world of my own, a world that runs on simple principles: growth, patience, and the quiet truth that even the most damaged soil can, in time, be persuaded to bloom again.
The relentless, yet strangely comforting cycle of the seasons, now marking the rhythm of my new life, taught me a profound lesson. Though the outer world must always endure its cycles of decay and frost, within each of us there remains the possibility of a sanctuary of hope, a place evergreen where, if tended with care, life can continue to flourish despite every hardship. I witnessed this truth most clearly on a day that had once been a dark scar on my heart, the anniversary of my abandonment. It passed not with tears shed in the solitude of my room, but with my hands buried in fresh soil, surrounded by the laughter of children. That simple act became the strongest declaration that I had at last transformed the day my life once ended into a day devoted to celebrating new beginnings. In one almost ordinary moment, when a young man addressed me with the familial respect I had been denied for 20 years, the sound rang within me like the power of a symphony. In that everyday sincere greeting, I heard my place restored, not only within the community, but within the natural and compassionate order of life itself. And as I looked upon the vibrant life I had created from nothing, I came to the final understanding of my story. My past was no longer the tale of a woman buried under a heap of lies, but the tale of a gardener given nothing but scorched, poisoned earth, armed with patience, soiled hands, and an unbreakable faith in the power of a single seed. She had turned that barren ground into a paradise. As I watched my daughter, a talented and intelligent woman in her own right, seek my opinion on a complex matter of work, I felt a quiet pride and a profound shift of roles. The fire of our shared past, which had burned away every false posture between us,
had left in its place a relationship built upon the solid foundation of mutual admiration and an unspoken recognition of the resilience we both carried. I realized that the greatest wisdom I could offer her did not come from the world of balance sheets and profit margins, the very world once ruled by her father's lies, but from the soil itself, where I had learned simple, honest, and profound truths, that some things cannot be forced, that true strength requires deep roots, and that sometimes the greatest act is to wait patiently for the right conditions to reveal themselves. I understood then that my greatest victory over my husband's legacy of ruin was not the money reclaimed or the restoration of my name, but this unbroken chain of life, love, and laughter. In that perfect sunlit moment, watching my grandchild play freely in the garden that had become the symbol of my rebirth, untouched by any shadow of fear, I knew what triumph truly meant. And as I came to that final peaceful understanding of my life's purpose, I saw how the cauldron of lies, once meant to destroy me, had, in its strange way, burned away the illusion of comfort. In its place, it had forged a family tempered in the unbreakable alloys of truth, empathy, and hard-won strength. A legacy I would no longer pass down as a tale of sorrow, but as a living inheritance of survival.
I realized that the mornings which had once been filled either with the anxious dread of facing a judging world, or later with the feverish energy of a hidden war, had now transformed into something entirely different. Watching the sunrise was no longer the beginning of another day of survival, but in itself a complete and satisfying event, a quiet and precious ritual of peace. I made my final peace with the ghost of my younger self, no longer seeing her as a naive girl easily deceived, but as a brave young woman, radiant with a beautiful, trusting light the world had not managed to extinguish. And I understood then that my long journey had never been about becoming someone new, but about returning at last to the resilient essence of who I had always been, and honoring her. In the simple, everyday beauty of a casual phone call with my daughter, free at last from the unspoken weight of our shared trauma, I heard, in the easy laughter between us, the clearest proof that we had not only survived the storm, but had finally reached calm, sunlit waters, a quiet harbor. And in that final understanding of freedom, I saw it not as some grand dramatic event, but as the ability to remain firmly in the present, untroubled by the ghosts of the past or the uncertainties of the future. Freedom was this hard-won, inward state of stillness, as carefully tended as the most fragile sapling in my garden.
On one of those quiet evenings when the rain beat against the windows, I felt a sudden, silent urge rise within me, not to reach out to a man who was now nothing but dust and memory, but to set down the unspoken words on paper, not as an accusation, but as a final and personal inventory of a life both broken and remade, a way to express at last for myself the full and unvarnished landscape of my journey. In that letter, which would never be sent, I wrote that I did not forgive him. But I did finally understand him. Not his actions, but the weakness and fear that had driven them. And I recognized that his greatest crime was not the slander or the betrayal, but the tragic squandering of a life and a love too vast for so small a man to truly cherish or sustain. That realization brought not anger, but a deep and final pity. As I read back over this narrative of pain, resilience, and in the end, quiet victory, I understood that the true purpose of the letter was never to deliver a message to the dead. It was to serve as a final testimony for the living, the closing argument in a trial held entirely within the courtroom of my own soul. And in the profoundly cleansing, symbolic act of watching the physical embodiment of that long history of pain and reconciliation turn to ash and rise as smoke, I did not see an erasure of the past. I saw instead the ultimate release, the transformation of a heavy, tangible burden I had carried into something weightless, untouchable, and finally, truly finished. A story set free.
In the very space that had once stood as a monument to my ruin and utter loneliness, I now hosted a joyful gathering that confirmed in the clearest and most undeniable way that my quiet, personal acts of rebuilding had become not just my own refuge, but a tangible sanctuary woven into the fabric of the entire town. To hear the leading figures of the very community that had once cast me out speak my name with such genuine affection and respect was an overwhelming, humbling experience. It felt less like a personal triumph and more like a collective moment of healing, as if the town itself, at long last, was granting its own silent absolution for the great wrong once done. In that moment of crystalline perfection, when my grandchild placed a simple fallen leaf into my hand, I knew that this small, fleeting gift was worth more than all the money or property we had reclaimed, for it symbolized the one thing my husband's wealth and lies could never create: the quiet, unadorned, and unconditional legacy of love that would continue to grow long after I had gone. As I watched the warm light of that little conservatory push back the autumn night, I came to my final understanding of my place in the world. My long and arduous journey had never truly been about a husband or his betrayals. It had always been about something universal: the search for a small, warm, and well-lit place in the vast and often cold darkness of the world. Or, if such a place could not be found, the courage to build it with one's own hands.
After the jubilant celebration, the deep calm that settled over the room was not an empty silence, but one filled with the warm, enduring embers of shared joy and community. It stood in sharp and beautiful contrast to the cold, isolating silence that had defined my world for decades, and it warmed my spirit. When I heard my daughter's heartfelt words, her simple declaration of pride, a wave of maternal love and gratitude swept over me, feeling like the most precious reward of my long struggle.
For in those words lay the confirmation that the greatest inheritance I could leave her was not a business or a property, but the living example of a woman's capacity not only to endure the unendurable, but to bloom in its aftermath. With that shared understanding, I told her that this place had not been built in spite of my suffering, but in many ways because of it. The pain had carved out within me a space that could now be filled with unique and hard-won empathy, and the lies had taught me the profound worth of cultivating a sanctuary dedicated only to what is honest and true. In that beautiful, unexpected discovery, I saw how the final act of betrayal, the slander that was meant to sever me from my community and my purpose, had paradoxically become the catalyst for forging a deeper, more meaningful bond with my daughter. It had transformed our relationship from simple maternal love into a true partnership rooted in resilience and shared creation. As I stepped away from that shining sanctuary, I reached a final understanding of what it means to leave a legacy. A true legacy is not a monument of stone left behind for others to admire, but a living, breathing garden nurtured in the hearts of others, a garden of strength, of hope, and of the quiet, unshakable knowledge that growth is always.
I realized that the first year since that fateful confrontation had passed, not with the storm of painful memories I once feared, but with the quiet murmur of ordinary days I had filled with small joys of my own choosing. The steady flow of those simple, uneventful moments had slowly and gently smoothed the jagged edges of my sharpest trauma, like a merciful hand softening the past. In an unexpected and strangely emotionless instant, my eyes briefly caught sight of one of my husband's children from his other life. And in that fleeting moment I understood he was no longer a symbol of betrayal to me, but simply a young person trying to find his way through the difficult currents of a life irreversibly altered by his father's choices. What I felt was not hatred, but a deep, weary awareness of life's tangled and often merciless interweaving. With a simple, deliberate gesture, I turned my back on that scene, not in anger, but as a conscious act of release. It was the embodiment of an inner choice to no longer allow the ghosts of their consequences to occupy my emotional landscape. Their story, with all its struggles and burdens, was now wholly theirs to write, and in my book not a single page remained. Sitting with my own children, I understood that true healing is not marked by the endless reopening of wounds, but by the moment you realize they have so completely scarred over that even a chance encounter with their cause no longer brings pain. Instead, it serves only as a quiet reminder of a battle long fought and decisively won. And in the serenity of planning a future I had once thought unimaginable, I grasped the ultimate lesson. The greatest revenge against someone who tried to erase your life is not to destroy theirs in return, but to live your own so fully, so honestly, and with such unapologetic joy that their memory and their betrayal become nothing more than a trivial footnote in the vast, triumphant novel of your existence. where once my simple walks through town had been a painful parade of sidelong glances and whispered judgments, they had now become a quiet procession of gentle greetings and shared smiles. And each day I understood anew that the town had not only forgiven me for imagined sins, but perhaps more importantly, forgiven itself for the haste with which it had judged me. In discovering the vital and beautiful distinction between the crushing loneliness imposed by others and the liberating solitude chosen for oneself, I realized that for 20 years I had been a prisoner of the first. Now I was a willing, peaceful inhabitant of the second, a one-person kingdom where I was wholly and joyfully enough. The small house whose walls had once been a fortress of fear and shame, but which I had since returned to by choice as a sanctuary, now inspired in me a deep and enduring love. No longer defined by the absence of others, it was filled instead to the brim with the quiet, vibrant presence of my own tranquil spirit. In my relationship with my daughter, no longer dependent on constant words of reassurance or the reopening of old wounds to feel profound, I found immense comfort in the simple, unspoken moments. In the silent river of shared understanding flowing beneath the surface of our ordinary days, our bond drew its true strength. And I came to see that the long, tortured road of my life had, in the end, led me precisely here, to the moment when I could look into my own reflection and see not the ghost of a slandered wife, nor the weary veteran of a great battle, but a woman whole and complete, who had earned every line on her face and who was at last deeply at peace with the story they told.
I understood then that time is not a straight line pulling you further and further from who you once were, but a circle. And if you are patient and brave enough to walk its full circumference, it will eventually bring you back to the truth of that core, untainted self that existed long before the storms began. When I thought of the two great thefts I had endured, the theft of my good name in the eyes of the world, and the theft of my private history through my husband's secret life, I realized that true justice is not found in punishing the thief. It lies in the slow and arduous process of reclaiming ownership of your own story, of becoming its sole, rightful, and final narrator. I came to see that every person is a living story, and that my former husband's tragedy was his attempt to tear out the most important pages of mine. But it was a futile act, because he never understood that the power of a story lies not in its flawless telling, but in its ability to continue, to grow, and to find new meaning even after its most devastating chapters. I felt the peace that comes with accepting that some questions will never be answered and some wounds will never fully vanish. Instead, like the gnarled bark of an old and mighty tree, they become part of the landscape of who you are. A testament not to the damage endured, but to the fierce, unyielding determination to keep reaching for the sun. And I saw, finally, that the cauldron of slander and the long silent years had not been the story of my life, but only its necessary winter, a long and bitter season of rest and gathering strength, preparing the soil of my soul for the late, unexpected, and breathtaking spring in which I now myself living.
I wanted to tell you this long story, not as a bleak tale of sorrow and betrayal, but as living proof of the unexpected resilience of the human heart, a heart that, like the soil of a garden, can withstand the harshest winters and the most poisonous weeds, and yet emerge on the other side richer and more fertile. I learned along the way that the truth I had pursued so desperately was not simply a weapon to win a battle, but the only bitter medicine capable of cleansing the deep infection of a 20-year lie. However painful to swallow, it was the medicine that began the slow, agonizing, but ultimately necessary process of true healing. I found my peace not in the impossible and unnecessary act of forgiving the man who betrayed me, but in the far more vital act of forgiving myself, forgiving the young, trusting girl I once was for her innocence, and the woman I became for failing to see what was never meant to be seen. In doing so, I lifted the greatest weight from my shoulders. In the end, I discovered that real strength does not lie in being unscarred or in avoiding heartbreak. It lies in the quiet, deliberate, and often solitary act of gathering your shattered pieces and, with patience and your own hands, rebuilding not the life that was stolen from you, but a new life, stronger, truer, and more beautiful, that is entirely your own. Remember this: every life will face unexpected frosts and invasive weeds, but when you have the courage to prune what is dead and the patience to nurture what is living, no matter how ravaged the ground may seem, every garden will, in time, bloom again.